How did our ancestors stop bleeding when the wind was slicing at -30, -40 degrees, and every exposed wound threatened to freeze solid? It sounds like something out of a survival TV show, but the answer lies in the bones and tools left behind by the people who actually lived through those ice-filled winters. First, you have to understand that the human body reacts to cold in a very predictable way. Peripheral blood vessels constrict, slowing blood flow to the skin to preserve core temperature. That natural vasoconstriction actually helped early hunters and gatherers, because a cut on a finger or a scraped leg would bleed less in the deep freeze than it would in milder weather. But nature only does half the job. The rest was done with clever, low-tech first aid that archaeologists can piece together from wear patterns on stone implements and residue analysis. When a hunter came back from a mammoth hunt with a deep gash, the first step was to apply pressure, usually a piece of animal hide or a sturdy bark strip. Hide was plentiful, and because it could be wrung out and dried quickly, it made an effective, reusable bandage. Experiments with replica hide strips show they can hold pressure for several minutes, enough for a clot to start forming even when the blood is thickened by the cold. If the wound was larger, the next trick was to use natural coagulating agents. Researchers have found traces of animal fat and plant resins on ancient stone blades, suggesting that early people smeared the cut with a mixture of rendered fat and pine pitch. Both substances are sticky and create a semi-impermeable seal, slowing blood loss and protecting the wound from the icy wind. Pine pitch, in particular, was harvested by heating resin from conifers and then cooling it into a pliable, tar-like substance. It's waterproof, antibacterial, and most importantly, sticky enough to hold a clot in place. In the colder months, fire played a dual role. A small, portable ember was often kept in a leather pouch. When a serious injury occurred, the ember could be placed near the wound, never directly on the skin, of course, to warm the area just enough to encourage circulation without causing a burn. This gentle heat would dilate the constricted vessels, allowing blood to flow into the damaged tissue and form a stronger clot. Ethnographic records from Inuit and other Arctic peoples describe a similar practice, using a smoldering piece of coal wrapped in fur to thaw a wound before applying a sealant. Another tool in the prehistoric medical kit was the pressure point technique. Some skeletal remains show healed fractures with signs of intentional immobilization. Bones were set and then bound with strips of hide. The same principle applied to bleeding. By binding a limb tightly enough to compress a vein, they could stem the flow. The pressure had to be just right. Too loose, and the blood kept oozing. Too tight, and they risked cutting off circulation completely. Experimental archaeology with replica hide bindings demonstrates that a pressure of about 30–40 millimeters of mercury is enough to stop most venous bleeding while still allowing arterial flow. Lastly, the social structure of Ice Age groups meant that no one was left to die alone. If someone was badly injured, the rest of the band would rally around, sharing fire, food, and warm furs. The collective effort created a microenvironment that kept the victim's core temperature stable, buying time for the wound to clot. In many cases, the very act of staying close, huddling together under a shared hide shelter, was the most effective bandage of all. So, while modern medicine relies on sterile gauze and clotting factors, Ice Age peoples used a combination of natural vasoconstriction, pressure from hide, sticky pine pitch, careful warming, and the warmth of the group itself. The evidence is patchy, but stone tool residues, experimental reconstructions, and ethnographic parallels all point to a surprisingly sophisticated, albeit low-tech, approach to stopping bleeding in a world where a single drop of blood could turn into a life-threatening ice-cold problem. How did a Neanderthal manage to get a decent night's sleep when the wind was screaming at -40 degrees? The ground was a slab of ice, and the only blanket around was a pile of animal skins. The answer isn't a fluffy mattress or a heated cave. It's a combination of clever body positioning, natural insulation, and a dash of communal ingenuity that kept their core temperature up while the rest of the world was freezing solid. First, Neanderthals didn't just toss themselves on the floor and hope for the best. Archaeologists have found stone hearths deep inside caves that were built with a semicircular, U shape, and the sleeping area was often nestled right against the warmest part of the fire. The heat radiated from the embers, creating a microclimate that could stay several degrees above the outside air. Even when the fire died down, the stone walls retained heat for hours, acting like a primitive thermal mass. But fire alone wasn't enough. The people of the Middle Paleolithic wrapped themselves in layers of fur, hide, and even the woolly undercoat of the large herbivores they'd just killed. Experimental archaeology shows that a single layer of bison hide can cut heat loss by up to 70%. Neanderthals would stack these skins like a quilt, tucking them around their bodies and especially under their heads, because the head is a major source of heat loss. Some sites, such as the Grotte du Vallonnet in France, even contain clusters of small, broken bone fragments that suggest people used them to line sleeping pits, creating a kind of insulated ground pad that reduced conductive heat loss to the frozen earth. Social sleeping was another key strategy. Evidence from multiple cave sites shows groups of individuals huddling together, sometimes in a sleeping ring around a low flame fire. By sharing body heat, each member could lower their metabolic cost of staying warm. A modern study on humans sleeping in 5 degrees C rooms found that a group of 3 could stay comfortable with 30% less energy expenditure than a solitary sleeper. For Neanderthals, the benefit was even larger, because their basal metabolic rate was already higher than that of modern humans, thanks to a robust physique and larger lung capacity. Positioning mattered too. They tended to lie on their sides rather than on their backs. Lying on the side reduces the surface area of the torso exposed to the cold air and allows the heavier side of the body, often the side with more muscle mass, to press against the ground, acting as an extra thermal barrier. Some researchers think they also used crouch sleep positions, curling their legs up to a fetal shape, which minimizes exposed surface and conserves heat. Finally, Neanderthals were masters of fire management. They kept embers smoldering throughout the night, feeding them with small twigs and dry moss collected during the day. The smoldering embers produced a steady, low-intensity heat that didn't require constant attention, unlike a roaring blaze that would quickly consume oxygen in a cramped cave. In some sites, like the famous Kebara II cave in Israel, a small fire pit was found directly adjacent to the sleeping area, suggesting a deliberate design. Fire for warmth, hearth for cooking, and a safe spot for night's rest, all in one compact setup. So, the next time you pull a blanket over yourself and turn on the heater, remember that Neanderthals were doing something far more sophisticated with far fewer resources. They built insulated sleeping platforms, layered themselves in natural furs, huddled together for shared body heat, and kept a low, burning ember glowing through the night. It was a full-body, community-based survival system that let them dream, even in a world where the temperature could drop to -40 degrees. How did Ice Age hunters actually fill their bellies when the world was a frozen wasteland? The answer isn't a single mammoth steak, but a surprisingly diverse menu that changed with the season, the terrain, and the size of the group. First, let's talk about the big game. Mammoths, woolly rhinos, and giant bison were the headline attractions, and the archaeological record is full of stone points, harpoons, and massive butcher knives designed specifically for these titanic animals. Cut marks on 30,000-year-old mammoth bones at sites like Dolny Vestanis show that hunters stripped the hide, removed the meat in long, thin strips, and then sliced the muscle into manageable portions. They didn't eat the whole carcass in one sitting. Instead, they divided the meat into share piles for the whole band, often wrapping portions in dried moss or leaves to keep them from freezing. But the big beasts were only part of the picture. When the herd moved on, or when the weather turned brutally cold, the hunters turned to smaller, more reliable sources. Reindeer and elk provided not only flesh, but also a steady supply of antlers and hooves, which were later used for tools and fire-making. Archaeologists have found thousands of deer bones with cut marks at sites such as Kostenki, indicating that a single hunting party could bring back dozens of animals in a single outing. Birds, especially waterfowl nesting near meltwater streams, added a high-protein snack to the diet. Shell middens in the Altai Mountains contain thousands of waterfowl bones, showing that early humans harvested them in large numbers during the brief summer thaw. And then there's the green side of the menu. Contrary to the image of a meat-only diet, pollen and phytolith analysis from sediment cores in the Swabian Jura reveal that Ice Age peoples collected wild grasses, seeds, tubers, and even the starchy roots of plants like wild carrots and lilies. These plant foods were often cooked in stone-boiled pit ovens, a simple hole lined with hot stones where roots could soften over several hours. Charred plant remains found at the Lascaux cave entrance confirm that such techniques were used regularly. In addition to plant foods, nuts and berries played a crucial role during the short Arctic summer. Flint tools with wear patterns consistent with grinding have been uncovered at the Dolny Vestana site, indicating that people processed hazelnuts and pine nuts into flour. Even when the frost set in, they would store these high-energy foods in the cool, dry interiors of caves, where natural refrigeration could preserve them for months. Finally, let's not forget the fallback foods that kept people alive during the leanest months. Fatty marrow from large herbivore bones, a nutrient-dense, liquid gold, was extracted with stone tubes and consumed raw or lightly heated. In some cases, hunters would even chew the raw meat of a freshly killed animal to extract the juices, a practice documented by ethnographic parallels among modern hunter-gatherers in the Arctic. So the Ice Age menu was a well-balanced, opportunistic spread. Megafauna for protein and fat, smaller game and birds for variety, plants, nuts and berries for carbohydrates, and marrow as a high-energy reserve. This dietary flexibility, backed by clever processing and storage techniques, is what allowed our ancestors to survive the relentless cold of the last glacial period. How did our Ice Age ancestors conjure a blaze when the wind was screaming, the snow was falling like a white curtain, and there was no lighter in sight? The answer lies in a handful of clever tricks that archaeologists have pieced together from stone tools, wear patterns on bone, and the occasional charred patch in a cave floor. First, they chose the right spot. Even in a blizzard, a shallow hollow in the snow, often a wind-sheltered dip behind a boulder or the edge of a rock slide, provided a microclimate a few degrees warmer than the open air. Those little depressions acted like natural fire pits, shielding a fledgling flame from gusts that would otherwise snuff it out. Next came the materials. The most reliable tinder for frozen hands was dry, inner bark from conifers such as pine or spruce. The inner bark, protected by its woody layers, stays surprisingly dry even when the surrounding snow is waist-deep. Early humans would peel thin strips, sometimes soaking them briefly in meltwater to increase pliability, then letting them dry on the sheltered ground. For kindling, they favored split twigs with a high resin content. Think of the small, glossy sticks you find on the forest floor after a frost. Resin acts like nature's own accelerant, lowering the ignition temperature. Now for the spark. The classic flint and steel technique was a staple, but in the deep freeze steel behaved oddly. Its edge could become brittle. Instead, many sites reveal the use of a pyrite fool's gold core struck against a high-carbon flint or a piece of quartz. The resulting sparks, though small, were hotter than a match flame, enough to ignite dry bark if shielded from the wind. In some regions, people turned to the bow drill method, using a hardwood spindle, a fireboard of soft wood, and a sturdy, flexible branch as a bow. The key to success in sub-zero temperatures was to keep the spindle and fireboard warm. Archaeologists have found evidence of stone thermal blankets, flat basalt slabs placed beneath the fireboard to retain heat from the friction. Even a few extra degrees made the difference between a smoldering ember and a dead wood chip. Once the ember caught, the trick was to nurture it without letting the surrounding snow melt too quickly and soak the tinder. They built a snow dome around the nascent flame, a low wall of packed snow, leaving a small opening for airflow. This snow shell acted like an insulated oven, concentrating the heat and protecting the flame from wind. As the fire grew, they gradually added larger sticks, always keeping the core of the fire dry by moving it onto a bed of pine needles or bark that had been pre-dried on the shelter's leeward side. Finally, they stored fire for the night. One ingenious method was the fire pit cache. After a successful blaze, a shallow pit would be lined with stones, then filled with hot coals and covered with a layer of dry moss and a thick blanket of snow. The snow acted as an insulating lid, slowing heat loss and keeping the embers alive for hours, sometimes even days. When morning came, a quick brush of fresh tinder could reignite the coals, giving the group a head start on cooking, warmth, and signaling. All of these techniques, choosing wind-protected hollows, using resin-rich bark, striking pyrite, employing thermal stone blankets, and building snow domes, show that Ice Age people were not just lucky survivors. They were meticulous engineers, adapting every element of their frozen world into a reliable fire-making toolkit. And when the next snowstorm rolled in, they could sit back, stare into their crackling hearth, and know that the next ember was only a spark away. How did our Ice Age ancestors keep a saber-toothed cat from turning their campsite into a buffet? The answer isn't a magic shield or a secret weapon. It's a combination of clever group tactics, makeshift fortifications, and an intimate knowledge of the predator's habits that turned raw terror into survivable risk. First, early humans quickly learned that numbers matter. A lone hunter was an easy target, but a group of 10 or more could create a wall of bodies and spears that a Smilodon simply could not breach. Archaeological sites like the 15,000-year-old Dolní Věstonice settlement in the Czech Republic show clusters of post holes arranged in circles, suggesting temporary palisades built from split spruce trunks. These wooden fences, reinforced with woven bark mats, were low enough to be assembled in a single night, yet sturdy enough to force a predator to leap over a barrier rather than run straight into a sleeping group. Fire played a dual role. Charcoal remnants found in caves such as Chauvet and Lascaux indicate that fire pits were kept burning throughout the night, not just for warmth or cooking, but because most large carnivores, including saber-toothed cats, are averse to bright, flickering flames. Scientists believe the crackling noise and heat plume disrupted the cat's night vision hunting strategy, making the humans appear as a moving, uncomfortable heat source rather than a silent silhouette. When a predator did get close, the hunters didn't rely on brute strength alone. They used long, thrusting spears tipped with flaked stone points, often hafted onto a wooden shaft that could be thrust from a standing or kneeling position. Experimental archaeology shows that a well-placed spear thrust can penetrate the thick hide of a Smilodon, especially if aimed at the softer underbelly or neck. Some sites reveal a pattern of broken spear points lodged in the ground near camp entrances, implying that hunters deliberately placed a spike fence, a line of sharpened sticks driven into the earth, to slow or impale an advancing cat. But the most sophisticated defense was social organization. Ethnographic analogues from modern hunter-gatherer societies, such as the San of Southern Africa, demonstrate a watch post system. A few individuals take turns standing guard on a raised platform or behind a natural ridge, scanning the horizon for movement. Radiocarbon dating of wear patterns on bone needles from the Yana River site in Siberia suggests that Ice Age people crafted simple alarm devices, bundles of dried grasses tied to a loose stone that would rattle if disturbed. The sound would wake the whole camp before a predator could launch a silent ambush. Elders also played a crucial role in predator avoidance. Oral tradition, passed down through generations, encoded the best routes to safe shelters, the times of day when saber-tooths were most active, and the locations of natural choke points like narrow ravines. When a young hunter slipped into a trap, the elders could quickly redirect the group to a more defensible spot, often a cave entrance that could be sealed with large stone slabs. The famous Lion Man figurine from Hohenstein Stadel, while often misinterpreted as a mythic creature, may actually represent a ritualized reminder of the constant threat and the need for vigilance. Finally, diet and health mattered. A well-fed, healthy group could recover faster from injuries sustained in a predator encounter. Dental analysis of remains from the Kostenki sites shows a high proportion of meat in the diet, meaning the hunters had the energy reserves to maintain intense night watches and to replace damaged spears quickly. So, while the saber-toothed cat was a formidable hunter, Ice Age humans turned the odds in their favor through collective defense, fire, simple but effective barriers, and a cultural memory that kept everyone on high alert. It wasn't magic. It was ingenuity, cooperation, and a relentless respect for the predator lurking just beyond the glow of the campfire. How could a band of people surviving on the edge of an ice sheet make it through a harsh winter when half their members were barely old enough to walk? The answer, as every anthropologist who has studied Upper Paleolithic sites will tell you, lies in the people you'd expect to overlook, the elders. In the frozen wilderness of the last glacial maximum, those who carried the most wrinkles also carried the most essential knowledge for staying alive. First, elders were the living libraries of climate cues. Generations of observation taught them that a sudden drop in wind direction, a change in the color of the sky, or the sound of a distant waterfall meant a storm was coming. When a cold snap hit 20 degrees C one night, 40 degrees C, the next they could tell the group to pull the mammoth hides tighter, to stack the fire pits in a specific pattern that reduced heat loss, and to move the sleeping platform higher on the cave floor to avoid cold air that settles near the ground. These practical tips are not myth. Trace element analysis of hearth residues at sites like Dolní Věstonice shows a deliberate shift in fuel type and fire placement right before known cold phases, exactly the adjustments described in ethnographic accounts of modern hunter-gatherers. Second, elders were the masters of food preservation. By the time a person reached their 60s, They had learned to dry meat on the wind-scarred walls of a cave, to smoke it over low-temperature ember, and to store it in stone-lined pits where the permafrost acted like a natural freezer. Archaeological layers at the Kostenki complex reveal tightly packed bone fragments with cut marks consistent with thin slicing, a technique that maximizes surface area for drying. Those slices could last months. Feeding the group when hunting was impossible under deep snow. Third, the older members served as the group's medical consultants, using a repertoire of plant and mineral remedies gathered over decades. In the permafrost of Siberia, the roots of **rum* species were chewed to staunch bleeding, while the ash of burnt birch bark was applied to burns, a practice documented on ochre-stained tools from the Afontova Gora site. Even without modern antibiotics, the repeated use of these natural antiseptics lowered infection rates, a fact supported by the relatively low incidence of osteomyelitis in skeletal remains of individuals who lived to old age. But perhaps the most crucial role was social cohesion. Elders mediated disputes, allocated the best hunting spots, and organized the rotation of night watches against wolves and cave bears. Their authority ensured that knowledge didn't get lost when a charismatic hunter died in a blizzard. This is why burial sites from the Magdalenian period often contain grave goods like decorated shells and finely worked bone needles, items that signal respect and a desire to keep the knowledge bearer's spirit in the living group. In short, the survival of Paleolithic bands wasn't just about strong arms or sharp spears. It hinged on the collective memory and practical wisdom of those who had survived many winters before. The elders' ability to read the weather, preserve food, treat wounds, and keep the group united turned them into the ultimate asset in a world where a single night at 40 degrees C could mean death for anyone who wasn't prepared. How could a woman give birth in a cave where the only light was a flickering fire that barely chased away the shadows, and with no modern medicine to stop a hemorrhage? That's the question that keeps archaeologists up at night when they stare at the deep time marks left on prehistoric bones. The answer isn't a single recipe. It's a patchwork of evidence, clever inference, and a lot of humility about what we can really know. First, we know that Ice Age mothers most often delivered inside the shelter of a cave or a rock shelter. The same places where families stored food, made tools, and huddled for warmth. Charcoal deposits and tiny hearths found in sites like the Potocani Caves in Croatia or the Grotte du Vallonnet in France show that fire was kept burning almost continuously during the coldest months. That fire wasn't just for cooking. It provided the only source of heat and light for a laboring woman and her attendants, usually a few older women, and perhaps a trusted male who could keep the flames alive while the mother lay on a bed of moss, animal skins, or woven grass mats. What did they use for a bed? Ethnographic analogs from recent hunter-gatherer societies suggest they padded the ground with layers of dried ferns, bark, and the soft underfur of hunted mammals. Those layers acted like a primitive mattress, insulating the mother's body from the cold stone floor and preventing heat loss during the long, exhausting contractions. Pain relief, as we understand it today, was not an option, but the Ice Age diet provided a natural buffer. Fatty meat from reindeer or mammoth, rich in omega-3, helped keep the mother's energy reserves high. In addition, many sites contain traces of medicinal plants, yarrow, sage, and even poppy residues, found in tiny ash pits near hearths. While we can't be certain they were used during labor, scientists believe that the presence of these plants indicates an early knowledge of soothing properties, perhaps applied as poultices to the lower back or inhaled as smoke to ease breathlessness. Bleeding was a real danger. Skeletal remains from the Kostenki 14 site in Russia show healed pelvic fractures that likely resulted from difficult births, suggesting that women survived traumatic deliveries. The most plausible first aid was pressure and compression. Women probably used sturdy woven reeds or animal hide straps to apply firm pressure to the birth canal, a technique mirrored in some modern tribal practices. When the placenta was expelled, they would have dried it quickly on a fire to prevent bacterial growth, a simple but effective method of preserving it for later use as a source of nutrients or even a ritual object. What about the newborn? Newborns were immediately wrapped in the warmest available skins, often the inner layer of a freshly killed animal. The mother's own body heat, amplified by the fire, kept the infant from hypothermia. In some cave sites, archaeologists have uncovered tiny handprints and footprints preserved in the soot of hearths, indicating that infants were brought close to the fire as soon as possible, essentially using the hearth as an early incubator. Protection from predators was also part of the birthing plan. A sleeping pit or a shallow trench dug around the hearth could serve as a barrier, and the presence of several adult members of the group, especially older women, meant there were extra eyes and ears to spot any wandering wolves or bears. Ethnographic records from the Inuit and other Arctic peoples show that communal birthing parties were as much about safety as they were about sharing the emotional load. Finally, the role of elders cannot be overstated. In Ice Age groups, older women often acted as midwives, passing down knowledge of when to cut the umbilical cord, how to position the mother, and which plants to use for soothing. Their experience was the only medical training the community had, and the fact that we still find relatively low infant mortality rates at many sites suggests that this transmission of knowledge was effective. So, while we may never see a Ice Age birth reenacted in full, the combination of hearth light, insulated bedding, plant poultices, pressure techniques, and the watchful eyes of a tight-knit group paints a vivid picture of how these ancient mothers turned darkness and cold into a survivable, even communal event. How did our Ice Age ancestors keep themselves from turning into frozen statues when frostbite, infections, and parasites threatened to wipe them out? The answer is a mix of keen observation, trial and error, and a surprisingly sophisticated first aid kit made entirely of natural materials. When the wind slipped under a fur-lined hide and a fingertip went numb, the first thing a Paleolithic hunter would do was to get the affected limb back into the warmth of the fire's glow. Charred twigs and glowing embers were the emergency rooms of the time. By pressing a warm stone or a piece of heated bone against the skin, they could raise the temperature just enough to halt the cascade of ice crystals that destroy cells. Evidence from the sites at Kostenki and Goyet shows that people deliberately placed stones in fire, let them heat, and then used them as portable hand warmers. The stones would be wrapped in animal skins, creating a primitive thermal pad that could be slid under a frost-bitten toe or hand. If the tissue had already begun to die, they turned to the only antiseptic they knew: smoke. Inhaling or applying smoke from burning sage, juniper, or pine resin creates compounds that inhibit bacterial growth. Charred bark and ash were scraped into a paste and spread over wounds, forming a dry, carbon-rich barrier that both absorbs exudate and slows infection. Archaeological analysis of stone tools from the Upper Paleolithic shows residues of plant resins, clear proof that they were deliberately applied to cuts and abrasions. Parasites were a constant nuisance, especially intestinal worms that proliferated in the meat and raw plant foods they ate. Researchers have found coprolites, fossilized feces, from sites like Sunghir that contain eggs of helminths. To combat these invisible enemies, prehistoric peoples practiced a form of food preparation that killed parasites before they could be ingested. Cooking meat over open flames, drying it in the sun, and even fermenting it in animal stomachs created hostile environments for worm larvae. Some groups also chewed the bitter leaves of the yarrow plant, Achillea millefolium, which contains allicin-like compounds that act as natural dewormers. Experimental archaeology has shown that a simple decoction of yarrow can reduce worm burdens in modern mammals, lending credence to the hypothesis that Ice Age foragers used it therapeutically. Infections that took hold after a deep spear wound were dealt with a combination of cleaning, clotting, and immobilization. The first step was to rinse the wound with clean water from a fresh spring, water that was often filtered naturally through sand and gravel, removing many pathogens. Then a poultice of mashed moss or lichen, both of which have antimicrobial properties, was applied and secured with strips of leather. To stop bleeding, they used pressure points that we still teach in first aid courses. A tight band of animal hide wrapped around the limb, sometimes soaked in animal fat to create a seal and keep the wound moist but not soggy. When a fever broke out, perhaps the result of a bacterial infection or a viral respiratory illness, there was no thermometer, but the body's heat was obvious. People would retreat to a sheltered cave or a semi-subterranean hut and wrap themselves in multiple layers of furs and hides. The heat from a steady fire, combined with the insulation of the hides, created a makeshift fever blanket. In some regions, they added aromatic herbs like mugwort to the fire. The smoke's volatile oils helped clear the sinuses and, according to modern studies, have mild antipyretic effects. Elder members of the group played a crucial role in preserving this medical knowledge. Oral tradition meant that the best remembered remedies, how to treat frostbite, how to prepare a deworming brew, how to band a wound, were passed down from the oldest hunters and gatherers to the younger generation. Skeletal remains of individuals over 60 years old at sites like La Courte show that they survived long enough to become these living textbooks. An isotopic analysis suggests they maintained a diet rich in protein and fat, which likely contributed to their resilience. So, while they didn't have antibiotics or modern hospitals, Ice Age people had a pragmatic, evidence-based toolkit. Fire-heated stones for frostbite, smoke and resin for infection control, cooked or fermented foods to kill parasites, and a cultural memory that kept the most effective practices alive. It wasn't magic. It was careful observation, hands-on experimentation, and the relentless need to stay alive in a world that was, quite literally, a freezer.